Hello everybody and welcome to this very exciting round glass review for the Irix 45mm f1.4 Dragonfly in Fuji GFX Mount. So this lens was designed by Irix and it was manufactured in Korea. It's the Dragonfly tier of Irix finish, which is partway between the Firefly and the Blackstone lenses. Has a lot of the Firefly features and a little bit of the higher end build quality internals, insofar as I can tell, of the Blackstone. This was originally released in April 2020, and insofar as I can tell, just a little bit more than 2 years later as this video is being recorded, it's still available new. For the GFX mount, this lens is slightly wide. It's a 45mm lens, but in terms of full frame equivalent, it performs about like a 35mm lens in terms of angle of view. However, it keeps the 45mm depth of field, which means that this is a interestingly wide lens with a very shallow depth of field across almost all of the range. So here's your bottom line up front. This would not be my first choice lens for the GFX system. The aperture is so fast that it's too shallow most of the time. The fast aperture can also render the focus peaking on camera bodies inaccurate. That was a problem I ran into a lot with the GFX 100S that I used this lens on. The size and weight for this lens also make it a challenge to carry because it is very large and very heavy. Now, all that said, the image quality and colors that this lens renders are staggeringly good, and the close focus is remarkable in a medium format lens. So ultimately, this lens is a mixed bag, with some significant complaints on my part for usability and some really strong image quality perks. And basically reading you the Irix website, the focal length and angle of view on GFX are 45mm and 62.64 degrees. The full frame version of this lens has a 51.4mm angle of view, and for those of you using the full frame lens on APS-C, it's approximately a 33-degree angle of view. The aperture range is 1.4 to 22. It has 11 lens elements in 9 groups. The design appears to be a sonar, but I could not find that on Irix's website, so I'm going off of just the appearance of the design. Filter size is 77mm. Closest focus is 40 centimeters. And for those of us in the US, that is half the size of the smallest pothole in our best roads. The focus type is manual only. The native mount for this version is GFX. Irix also makes an identically spec'd SLR version in Nikon F, Pentax K, and Canon EF mounts. I've read a number of reviews that indicate all 4 of those lenses are the same with just different rears attached to them. Irix's website didn't provide me the information I would need to conclusively say that, such as specifically a design for this mount lens, but given the performance of this lens and some of the specifications that it shares with the other lenses for the SLR mounts, it does seem likely that this is in fact those SLR lenses with the GFX mount on it. Dimensions are 87mm by 144, and it weighs in at a very, very heavy 1.12 kilograms. So my first tip for you is going to be that as a slightly wide lens on the GFX format, this lens seems like it should be really good for street photography and for general use. However, it really did not work well for that for me. Now the depth of field, even stop down on this lens, is pretty thin, and also it has a lack of focusing scales which limit its usability and also its ability to be used at all for some uses, specifically things like zone focusing. So the biggest challenge with using this lens is that it's just a little bit wonky because the depth of field is very thin, and that's because it's almost a 50mm lens, and those generally have fairly narrow depths of field. However, the angle of view is startlingly wide on GFX, it works like a 35mm lens, and those generally have significantly deeper depths of field than a 50mm. So this is a weird sort of hybrid, and it just doesn't do some things well because in some ways it performs like a 35mm and in some ways like a 50mm. It should be the best of both worlds, but it really isn't. Now all that said, as a general use walk-around lens, the Irix 45mm can yield some very nice images with amazing color and sharpness. Just using it puts some added hurdles in your way that other lenses of similar specifications might not. If the hyperfast aperture of f1.4 is important to you, then this lens is really your only choice right now as of this video's recording for GFX, and you'll need to decide if the trade-offs that this lens requires are acceptable to you for the speed. The close focus on this lens does make it a decent lens for things like tabletop product and still life photography, and as a general statement, given that this lens can be used well in a studio setting, it could be very good for that. Also, being fast and sharp, it could be a good studio portrait lens if you have stationary subjects that are comfortable with having a lens very close to them. Subjects I would recommend avoiding would be sports and action shots. The Irix 45mm's focus throw is too long for quick changes, and the lack of autofocus makes it hard to use on moving subjects. And also, having just said that it would be a good portrait lens for subjects comfortable with having a lens in their face, ultimately, I would not really recommend this as a portrait lens because the working distance on anything that isn't a full body shot is uncomfortably close. Now, one last tip. This lens vignettes a decent amount. If you like that look, go for it. If you do not want significant light loss, this is not your lens. You can, of course, correct that in post, but why would you give yourself added work that you don't need? Huge asterisk right here up front. Irix does not provide anywhere that I could find, either on their website or any other sources, reviews, whatever, online, the diagram for the GFX mount version of this lens. They do provide it for the full frame version, and that's what this diagram is of. There seems to be a general online consensus that they are the same lens. The specs definitely match in terms of the number of elements and groups and the aperture blades and so forth. However, I could not independently verify that from anything from Irix that this and the full frame lens are the same. So there is a good chance that this diagram just isn't accurate, and I wanted to be honest about that up front. But let's assume that this diagram is the accurate GFX lens diagram, and it's the same as the SLR mount. This lens really looks like, and generally performs like, a very good sonar lens design. And you can note the strong positive design forward of the aperture and negative elements and groups behind. I will say that I really like the way this lens renders images, and were it not for the challenges in usability with manual focus, depth of field, things like that, I would heartily recommend this instantly for GFX users across the board. As it is right now, there are some GFX users who could really capitalize on this lens, but not, I would say, the majority. Breathing is fairly well controlled at closer focus points with short focus throw, which would align with how this lens is likely to be used for video. This lens has significant promise as a videography lens for amateur videographers looking for a quality result. The aperture is stepless, the front element is both stationary and non-rotating, focus throw is a staggering 140 degrees, which gives you a lot of very fine focus control. The focus ring is stationary and very wide, making it very easy to grip. The focus damping for the copy that I had was good and smooth, and it was very easy to handle because of the grip's design, specifically the focusing ridge. And that's a nice touch, which I do really wish my Blackstone lenses had. Focus ring play was non-existent, and that's to be expected from a new and high-end lens. One final videography note for GFX video shooters: because of the 16:9 crop factor for video versus the stills 4:3 aspect ratio, you will see less vignetting in your video with this lens than the still images in this review exhibit. So if you're looking at this primarily as a GFX video lens, it could be an option that performs a bit more uniformly across your entire image area than what you're seeing in the stills here. The Dragonfly tier, which is halfway between the Firefly and the Blackstone, has a lot of the Firefly outward interface elements, and ultimately, for manual focus lens users, that's a mixed bag. The focusing ring is fantastic, and the ridge specifically is designed well. The lack of focusing scales makes this a hard lens to use, however, if you want to set it to preset focusing distances and rely on it for zone or hyperfocal distance use. The focus throw is appropriate for a high-end manual focus lens and allows for very precise focus. I found the aperture ring to be a bit of a pain to use because the ridges and the aperture ring itself are fairly narrow. The focus and aperture rings are well damped and very smooth, but I found the focus on the copy I had tended to shift easily when bumped, so the focus lock ring that this lens includes can be a useful tool, so ultimately, mixed bag. Contrast is very good, and very little work was needed in post with the images that this lens created. The aperture shape and blade count is 9 blades with a stepless aperture. I forgot to take photos for this review that show the source point stars, but it should create 18 pointed stars. Also, the aperture is smooth and well damped, so videographers could find that very enjoyable to use when shifting aperture during a shot. Autofocus area characteristics are weird. Sometimes I found them to be very smooth and other times jittery. This was different by focus point and aperture, of course, as is the case with every lens. Anecdotally, I would say this lens performs best from around f2.8 to f5.6, and at closer focuses in terms of out-of-focus area characteristics as well as overall image sharpness. For distortion, I'll ask you to please forgive the crooked graph paper alignment here. That was a mistake on my part. Despite the terrible alignment of this shot, that there is some barrel distortion on this lens, but nothing that in typical real-world shooting scenarios would affect image quality, and I think the real-world shots taken with this lens in this video exhibit that barrel distortion is not an issue for image creation. Light loss is dramatic on the GFX format. Even on full frame, this lens has noticeable light loss. At distant focus and wide open, in some settings, the lens appears to display the peripheries of the image circle in the GFS format's corners. Design flaws for this lens are highly corrected. I did not get any flaring with this lens at all. The rainbow in the flaring sample video here is from moisture in the clouds, not the lens. At closer focus points and wider apertures, I did have some shots with some petsful swirling. This was primarily an issue in parts of the image circle outside the full frame image area, and likely has to do with the image quality degradation in those regions. Stopping down to around f4 largely eliminated the issue of any sort of petsful swirling. Balance with cameras was not great. Even with a heavy GFX 100S behind it, this lens is large and it's a heavy mass of metal and glass that stick way out in front of the camera, and on anything lighter than the heaviest of flagship cameras, this lens is going to be very, very front heavy. This is a niche lens for niche users. The Irix Dragonfly 45mm f1.4 in GFX mount can deliver stunning results, but there are some usability challenges to get there. On GFX, this is a captivating and interesting lens option that, for the right user in the right setting, could be worth considering. But that's not a high number of users, nor is it a high number of settings. For those of us who use manual focus lenses often, this is honestly not a dream lens. As someone who uses manual focus more than autofocus, and by a hefty margin, I could not recommend this as a medium format manual focus lens. I found on the GFX camera I used it with that this lens's fast aperture led to the focus peaking being off by, in some cases, 8 feet, even stopped down to around f8. Now that's not a failing of this lens so much as a failing of the camera and also an indication of how shallow this lens's depth of field is, even when stopped down. The Irix 45mm f1.4 Dragonfly lens is rather like an old hand-powered drill in the age of benchtop drill presses. It will get the job done, and for people who really like the results and the craftsmanship that it requires versus a comparable and more technologically advanced option, it could be enjoyable to use. As a video lens, it is certainly a solid option. So I guess that maybe the best thing that I can say about this lens on GFX is that, for videographers, it has a definite potential place as an option for close shots with backgrounds visible and the ability to deliver smooth aperture changes. For stills photographers, however, were I in the market for a similar GFX format lens, I might keep my powder dry and explore other options.